Welcome to Semantic Backup Exec 2012, Simplified Disaster Recovery. We are in Lesson 7. In this lesson, we'll discuss Simplified Disaster Recovery fundamentals. This is the basics of doing a Simplified Disaster Recovery. We'll talk about what's new and some of the features and enhancements to this version of the product, and that it replaced an older product as well. We'll talk about doing a Simplified Disaster Recovery Qualified Backup and list the components that are required to back up in order to do a Simplified Disaster Recovery. We'll talk about how to protect computers using Simplified Disaster Recovery. And then we'll talk about creating a Simplified Disaster Recovery disk, or SDRD, that you boot to recover any machine that you have backed up using this protection method. And then we'll talk about how to do a recovery using Simplified Disaster Recovery and that disk that you have created. So let's start with the basics, Simplified Disaster Recovery fundamentals. This is a complete disaster recovery solution that is all driven by your backups. So all you really have to do is full backups and make sure that they are Simplified Disaster Recovery enabled. So it is a complete replacement for Intelligent Disaster Recovery, which was available in older versions of Backup Exec. So Intelligent Disaster Recovery is gone, is totally replaced with Simplified Disaster Recovery. Simplified Disaster Recovery can be compared to things such as NetBackup's bare metal restore or BMR capability, Semantic System Recovery, which used to be known as Backup Exec System Recovery, and Norton Ghost that uses the Semantic Recovery Toolkit. All of these pieces use the Semantic Recovery Toolkit. They're all different methods of doing a recovery on a server. Simplified Disaster Recovery integrates with your regular backup regimen. So you don't have to do anything special. Just make sure that you're backing up all the critical components, and now you're eligible to do Simplified Disaster Recoveries. From a terminology standpoint, the terminology here can get a little bit confusing. So we're going to talk about Simplified Disaster Recovery disks, SDRD, which are also known as Semantic Recovery Disks. So there are places in the documentation you'll see these two acronyms used interchangeably. So a Semantic Recovery Disk is also known as a Simplified Disaster Recovery Disk, but the acronyms are more than a little confusing. A point in time, or PIT, is what you specify that you would like to recover to when you do your Simplified Disaster Recovery. You can also do simplified volume layouts. This is where I am changing the volume layout from when it was backed up so that it looks differently when I restore it. And we'll take a look at those screens. That there are screens that allow you to change the size of the volumes. So they were backed up at one size, I restore them in a different size. I can do dissimilar disk restores or advanced disk configuration. So that's part of that simplified volume layout. Hardware independent restores are what this specializes in. Part of that is driven by what is on your recovery disk. So the idea here is that I can do a backup from, let's say for example, a tower machine and do a recovery of that backup on a laptop and still make it all work. So that's all driven by partly what's on your Simplified Disaster Recovery disk and the ability to make sure that the new machine can access the internet to download any drivers that are needed for the new hardware. Semantic System Recovery is a different tool. It uses a different mechanism for recovering machines. It is creating a V2I file, a file with a V2I extension that is the recovery point. So it's not integrated in your backups the way simplified disaster recovery is. Semantic system recovery was formerly known as Backup Exec System Recovery, and prior to that was known as Live State Recovery. Intelligent disaster recovery is the older version of simplified disaster recovery that was more steps to use, more time consuming to do the restore, and was not as hardware agnostic as what we're going to talk about today. So it has been completely replaced, and you are given something that is much easier to use and can be recovered to any hardware, which are both good things. The simplified disaster recovery disk that you boot to do a recovery. So the way this works is I'm going to do a regular backup on my regular basis that has the banner in the backup marked as simplified disaster recovery is on. It'll have a little green circle in the backup definition. When I need to recover a server that I've been backing up with SDR, I'm going to have to boot it to a simplified disaster recovery disk. You can download the ISO versions of the recovery disk from Symantec. There are two disks that you can use. One of them is a 32-bit recovery disk, and one of them is 64-bit. The bottom line is it depends on what kind of hardware you are recovering to, which disk you need. So if I am recovering to 32-bit hardware, I need the 32-bit DVD recovery disk. If I am recovering to 64-bit hardware, in most cases you can use either the 32 or the 64. What will determine whether or not you have to boot to the 64-bit DVD is if the hardware that you wish to recover to does not allow you to load 32-bit drivers. And the only time that you'll really know that is when you try to do the restore. So the recommended procedure on recovering your server is to download both the 32 and the 64, use your favorite tool, Nero or Roxio or Magic ISO, whatever you want to do to burn those DVDs, and then boot to the 32-bit. Always try to boot to the 32-bit first. Try to run the restore. If you get errors in the restore that it can't write to the hardware, then you'll have to boot to the 64-bit. Right, what that's telling you is that your hardware does not load 32-bit drivers. So you'll have two semantic disaster recovery disks. The 32 is more generic. Keep in mind that when you boot to this recovery disk, you're only booting to it temporarily. I am loading WinPE, and it's calling Backup Exec to restore all the data that you had backed up. Once that restore is finished, you remove the DVD that you booted to, and you let the machine boot to all the files that you have restored. And now it's going to boot into whatever environment it was that you backed up. So I can boot the machine to a 32-bit disaster recovery disk and call a backup of a 64-bit OS. I remove the DVD, boot the machine into Windows, the 64-bit OS that I restored from my backup, and now the machine will permanently be 64-bit. So the DVD is only there temporarily to call the backup. So you boot to the simplified disaster recovery disk. You'll see a wizard come up, and you click recover this computer. The recovery disk is a minimal version of Windows 7. It's known as WinPE. It has two other tabs on it. We'll take a look at that here in a moment that include network and utilities, and this is where I could load other drivers such as NIC drivers, or I can map a network drive if I need to. On this recovery CD or DVD, it has the Backup Exec agent for Windows and tape and loader drivers so that it can access the backups. So I can back up any machine in my environment using Backup Exec and make sure that simplified disaster recovery is on, and then recover any machine in my environment simply by booting it to this CD. The agent will then contact the Backup Exec server and say, I need to have data restored to me. And so that agent allows us to restore the data across the wire. Anytime that you run a backup that is simplified disaster recovery compliant or enabled, one of the things that it will do is keep a file with a .dr extension for disaster recovery. This file is whatever the host name is, .dr. It contains computer-specific information, but it also contains the catalogs for the backup that is SDR enabled. Backup Exec will automatically store these DR files in the default location on the Backup Exec server. In the restore lesson, we talked about also copying that to another location. So a best practice is to let these DR files be stored on the Backup Exec server, but in the configuration for Backup Exec, you can configure an alternate path for these DR files. If everything is stored on your Backup Exec server and the data center burns to the ground, if all your DR files were there, it's going to be very difficult to do disaster recoveries. So it's important that these DR files be in multiple locations, preferably off-site from your data center. If the Backup Exec server crashes, you'll still need to be able to access these files. So you can retrieve them from the alternate location if you had configured one. To use simplified disaster recovery, you must have Backup Exec 2012. If you have older versions of Backup Exec, you will be using Intelligent Disaster Recovery, which works very differently. The agent for Windows must be installed on any remote machine that I wish to back up, or it be another Backup Exec server. You need to have encryption keys for files if they're encrypted, or volumes that are encrypted. I need to have some kind of third-party application for burning CDs or DVDs, and I talked about that earlier, that I download the semantic recovery disk. And I have to have some kind of device that will allow me to write a CD or a DVD. So what's changed? Going from intelligent disaster recovery into simplified disaster recovery. Several things are new. In older versions, you had to create the bootable CD, and it was a long process. In simplified disaster recovery, we include the 32-bit and a 64-bit recovery DVD. You can customize that and create your own with your own drivers if you choose to. When you boot to that DVD, you have a very simple screen that says recover this computer, and we'll take a look at it. So you can walk right through doing a recovery. We have a new type of backup that does full system protection that is very easy to identify when you run your backups, that will show you that simplified disaster recovery is enabled. The Restore Anywhere component is a component that came from other products, specifically semantic system recovery, that allows you to recover to any hardware. So I could back up my data from any hardware and restore it to any other hardware using this component. This component contains two types of drivers. The drivers that are loaded with it automatically are network interface cards, or NIC drivers, and mass storage device drivers, also hard drive drivers. This allows me to restore anything, and it will come up, but you may have to then download other drivers if you have significantly changed your hardware. So I may have to download video drivers and sound card drivers if the hardware has significantly changed. It uses a very simplified volume layout process so you can change the configuration of the hard drive. The DR files are automatically maintained for you. That's a big change from older versions. So we will automatically write the disaster recovery files to the Backup Exec server and whatever alternative location you have provided. And that we do allow you to duplicate simplified disaster recovery jobs, so I can duplicate those to other locations for off-site storage. Let's take a look at the simplified disaster recovery backup. So I have to back up my data appropriately. I have to make sure that the backup is set to protect all the critical system devices. We'll take a look at that in detail. You have to also make sure that dynamic server selection is on. That's dynamic inclusion. I have to make sure that all of my recovery methods that are non-system critical are also being supported. In other words, I should back up the critical system protection pieces, the C drive and system state, and also have backups for non-critical things, meaning the applications and data on that server. So it's a balance between the two. Backup Exec automates that process for you. This simplified disaster recovery complements all these different recovery methods, and it is the basis for physical to virtual conversions and backup set to virtual conversions, which are the next lesson in this material. What qualifies as critical system devices? So when I run a backup that is simplified disaster recovery enabled, what I must back up are system volumes. This includes the list that you see here. Boot volumes. In Windows 7 and Server 2008 R2, the boot volumes are actually two pieces. It is by default 100 meg boot partition that is a hidden volume plus the C drive. Backup Exec understands that, and it just gets it for you. It will only be displayed to you as the C drive, and that's a function of Windows. Windows by default hides the boot volume. Service volumes becomes a bit more gray. Most of the time this is the C volume, but this depends on how you installed any applications that run services. For example, if I installed SQL on this server and I installed SQL itself, not the databases, but SQL itself to a drive other than C, then the service volume for SQL would be the drive where I installed it. So I may need a D drive to be included as a critical system device if I had installed the application to a non-default location. So the question here becomes, where are the services running from? By default, for applications, they should be running from C:\program files. But again, this will vary with how you had it installed. System state devices, the whole list that you see here includes system state. Not all machines will have this entire list. It depends on how the machine is configured. And the volume that contains system state must be backed up. So this is the list of things that I have to back up in order to do a simplified disaster recovery. It looks complicated. Backup Exec automates the whole process for you and will let you know that you're backing up the right things to do simplified disaster recovery. Non-critical system and application devices are where you're storing data. In a typical SQL installation, SQL will be installed, the SQL services will run from the C drive, but the databases and transaction logs will run from other volumes. So that would qualify as non-critical system and application devices. Usually what you will do is recover the critical system devices, the C drive, using simplified disaster recovery let that server come up and reboot, and then begin a regular restore of non-critical system items using just the agent that was in the system that you recovered using simplified disaster recovery. So to do a full restore of an application server, it's usually going to be a 2-pass restore. One to get the system volumes back, reboot, and then another to restore all the data. But you could do it all at one time, depending on many different variables in your environment. Shadow copy components often show up as non-critical. This really depends on what's being stored in those shadow copy components. By default, Backup Exec will automatically back up all of the critical system pieces when you tell it to back up the server. So we use implicit selection or dynamic inclusion, which is also known as dynamic inclusion. So we will automatically discover and protect any volumes that have been added to that server. You can explicitly include or exclude devices, and we've talked about that in more detail in the backing up data lesson. When I look at a backup job for a particular server, if it is qualified and you're backing up the right things to do simplified disaster recovery, you will see beside the server name a little green circle that shows that everything is good and you could do simplified disaster recoveries based on this backup. So Backup Exec automatically will set it up so that it is SDR enabled and show you that it is. If I look in the details, if I edit the selections and look in the details of what I'm backing up, you'll see the banner across the top of your selections that says Simplified Disaster Recovery is on. If you uncheck any of the critical pieces, the C drive or system state being 2 of them, if you uncheck those, you'll see that Simplified Disaster Recovery goes off and the little green light will go off, and then you could not do SDR-based recoveries. So you can drill down and select what you need. In this case, in this screenshot that you see here, you'll notice that the Windows directory of the C drive has been unselected. You'll see the X in that box. And the banner at the top of the screen says Simplified Disaster Recovery is turned off. By default, we would automatically set it up for you. I can exclude non-critical system devices and still have Simplified Disaster Recovery enabled, and that's what this screenshot is showing you, that we are still backing up the C drive and system state. However, we are not backing up SQL in this particular job. I would probably have another backup definition that would be backing up SQL, and I would do 2 separate restores. SDR can be explicitly enabled or disabled if you chose to, if you had unmarked some of the selections so that we were no longer doing implicit dynamic inclusion. If you right-click on where Simplified Disaster Recovery is turned on or off, you can re-enable it by telling it to select all necessary components, and it will just check all the boxes for you. If it's on, you can also tell it to disable if you choose to. If you're running older versions of Backup Exec, meaning the agent on that server that you're backing up, an older agent can talk to a newer Backup Exec server. So my Backup Exec server is 2012. The agent that is running on the server that I'm backing up is 2010, Backup Exec 2010. When you go to back that up, what you will notice is there will not be any indication of Simplified Disaster Recovery at all. The little green circle is not on the selections page, and if I go to selection details, I cannot see that banner that shows simplified disaster recovery. The only way that I could do simplified disaster recovery of that machine would be to update the agent to Backup Exec 2012. Everything has to be 2012 in order to do simplified disaster recovery. You do have to have correct rights to read the data that you need to back up, and it will show you that we cannot access the data to do the backups if it has that kind of problem. Backup operator should have enough rights to do the backup. Backup operator does not have enough rights to do the restore. So you may get errors, and it will tell you that you may need additional privileges in order to do that. If you want to customize your simplified disaster recovery disk, you can do so. So I can add drivers. I can add specific drivers to the semantic recovery disk. The simplified disaster recovery disk by default should boot most machines. It is best to test it. If you run it on a machine that is already running, it should come back and tell you what drivers you would need to add to the disk, and in most cases it's none. But you should test it. I can also update the disk with the latest version of the disaster recovery components when those patches become available. So there's a wizard that displays the list of computers that are backed up by the Backup Exec server, and it allows me to add any drivers from those servers. So if we go to the Backup Exec button and click on Configuration and Settings and Create Disaster Recovery Disk, it will bring me into the wizard screen that will allow me to add drivers. So the first screen simply says that we're getting ready to create a new recovery disk. It will ask you for your previous CD or DVD if you burned it, or you can just mount the ISO that you have downloaded from Symantec. So you would have to browse to the path for that ISO. Then it will show you all of the drivers that are being used by all the computers that Backup Exec is backing up. So it's showing you all of the servers that Backup Exec has backed up, what drivers it's using, and you can select off this list to add any of those drivers to your existing recovery disk, and then you can create a new one based on this. It will show you NIC drivers and mass storage drivers. You cannot add any other type of drivers to this CD, DVD. You can only add NIC drivers and mass storage drivers, but you can add drivers for those if you need to. So if you click on Add Driver, you could then specify which driver you want to add. You then specify what the name of this CD should be or DVD, and where you want the ISO to be written. So you're creating a brand new ISO with your additional drivers on it. This is the options that you'll see as the machine boots up to this CD. So what time zone should it be in, what language will be used, and what keyboard layout do you want. It will give you a summary. The wizard will give you a summary of what you're about to create. And then you'll see it creating the ISO. This may take several moments before you'll see the ISO actually finish. And then it will come back and tell you that it has created the ISO. At this point, you would need to use whatever your favorite tool is to burn physical DVDs. So Nero or Roxio or Magic ISO or such, anything that you like to burn DVDs, you would need to burn this to a physical DVD so that to do your recovery, if one of your servers died, you could boot them to that DVD. So how do I use Semantic Simplified Disaster Recovery to do disaster recoveries? the first thing that you're going to need to do is boot the machine that you wish to recover to the DVD. Hopefully you've created it sometime in the past with the correct drivers on it. It will bring up a window that allows you to say recover this computer, and then you can select the point in time that you would like to recover to. So this is the backups that you have run, your regular backups. You just select which backup you wish to recover, or you can create a local recovery option and provide the disaster recovery file, the DR file. You're going to have that DR file though. Walk through the wizards. It's very straightforward at that point, and click recover. And then you'll need to let the machine reboot. So let's take a look at this process. When I actually boot the machine, you'll see it booting to the CD, and it will ask you what language you wish to boot into. And it takes about 2.5 or 3 minutes, and then it will come up to this screen that you do have to accept the end user license agreement. And this is the main screen that you'll see. So it has 3 tabs, one for recovery, one for network, and one for utilities. The recovery tab is very simple, straightforward, recover the computer. The networking tab allows you to do some very basic diagnostics for IP configuration, but it will also allow you to map a drive if you need to. You have to have a NIC driver loaded in order to be able to map a drive. In some cases, you may not have a NIC driver loaded at this point, so you would have to go to the Utilities tab to do so. You can change the network adapter configuration settings so that it is obtaining an IP address, or you can set it for a specific IP address. You can also use the Utilities tab to gather up log files to send to tech support if you have an open case with tech support. And then you could output the log files to the mapped drive. So now we're ready to recover our computer. I have to tell it where the computer's backup data is located. So is it on a Backup Exec server, or is it on a tape drive that you have attached to this server or removable disk? If you are connecting to a Backup Exec server, you must provide the credentials to make a valid connection. You can also at this point load network drivers if you need to. So this is another location that you can use to load NIC drivers. In our case, we're going to click Next, and it will show us which backup sets are available, and you choose the one that you wish to recover. So this is my point in time. This, by default, it will always show you the most current backup available, but it shows it to you as an entire set. So if I had been running fulls and partial backups during the week, it knows that it needs to send the most recent full and every incremental since, or the most recent differential, and it doesn't ask you which do you want to do. It simply says, this point in time, I can recover to Thursday, is that okay with you? And you can pick an older one if you have to, if you would like to. It automates the whole process of putting those dependencies together. It understands that the full and the partials went together, and it restores them as a group appropriately. You can change the volume layout if you choose to. So this looks very much like Disk Manager. If I choose to change the volume layout, this is my advanced disk configuration. This is where I can change drive letters or format the volumes. So I can shrink and expand volumes. It will confirm that this is the volume layout that you wish to use. I can also load storage controller drivers here. If I choose to load storage controller drivers, you would have to be sure that you have those drivers available to you. They should be on the CD. And it comes back into the disk layout screen, and then we click Next. It will show you a summary of the recovery, and then you'll see it run. This may take several minutes for this to run, depending on how much data and how far away it is on the network. So it will take it a while to run. You'll see it running. It will do a hardware discovery at that point, meaning that it's trying to make sure that the drivers that are needed to reboot this machine are available when the machine reboots. It will show you that it is installing all the devices. This is NIC and mass storage devices. And then it will tell you that you have finished. You're welcome to read the logs if you choose to. When you click finish, it will ask you, are you sure you're finished, and do you want to reboot? When you say you want to reboot, what you'll need to do is remove the DVD from the drive and allow the machine to boot to Windows. This may also take a few moments, and it will probably, if you changed hardware, require a second reboot before you're ready to restore other data. It will show you that it is performing final tasks before it does the reboot, and then you are ready to reboot into where you were at the time of your last backup. So now you have done a complete simplified disaster recovery. So we have talked about the basics of how you run a simplified disaster recovery. We've talked about the new features that are available to you, how I create a simplified disaster recovery disk, and how I perform a disaster recovery using this disk and the tools that are provided.